Let's take a look at the graph editor. So here I am in Maya, and I'm just going to create a blank scene at this time, just so that we can get used to the graph editor and how it works before we get into a character with lots of different strings that might be overwhelming. So follow along with this tutorial and just say File, New Scene, and start with a blank scene. Of course, you'll want to save your scene if you abandon your previous scene. So I'm just so that we can see sort of orientation, I am going to use underneath the poly modeling shelf, and here I am under the modeling. I'm going to use a cube so that we can see that a little bit more cleanly, and we'll take this into 2 dimensions. So hitting the spacebar on my keyboard to activate the viewport, I'll jump down to the front view and hit spacebar again, and we'll just have a few keyframes for this. I'm going to reduce my frame numbers here, and actually I'll do that on this side. So I'll give us 48 frames, and we'll start at 1 and end at 48. So starting out our cube here, I'll just move it over, and you can see it's roughly -8. Tap S on my keyboard to keyframe that, and I'll go ahead and turn on auto keyframing at this time. Position the playhead, so I'll go to 12, half a second, and move it up to about there, so about 6 and 0. If you want to be very deliberate with those numbers, that's fine, but just to give you an idea of where we are, the numbers don't really matter. We just want to make sense of the motion here. So you can see there's a very direct path as I scrub through the timeline. Going forward to 24, I'll move it down here, sort of similar. It looks like plus, trying to do sort of a circle here, but we'll see that type of motion. And then moving forward even further, we'll go down here. And I think we had, 6. Yep, that's about right. And then our final one here will actually be a repeat of this one. And we'll see how that cycles and how we might consider that using the graph editor. So with this selected, I'll middle mouse button click in and drag to the destination and release my middle mouse button. You'll see that it stays there, and I'll tap S on my keyboard to preserve that. So now if we play this through, and I do have it looping at this time, we can see this. And if I were to look at that from the perspective camera, we shouldn't see any of the Z depth. Okay. So I'll jump back to the front view so that we can just understand it a little bit cleaner. A couple other things to note: I am working with 24 frames per second, and if I open up my preferences here, which I can get to by going to Windows, Settings and Preferences, but also just jumping down to the little orange guy with the gear here, and that will take me directly to the time slider itself. You can see here that I'm also playing this back in real time. So that's really important that we're playing in real time. So there we go. And we can see that happening with our playback. So let's do it. So as we play through, we can see how that works. But instead of having this direct line, we can see that linear interpolation here. I want it to kind of ease into that keyframe right there. So I'm going to do all of this within the graph editor, and we'll have a nice circular or whatever kind of pattern we want, quite frankly. So to get into the graph editor, I'm going to go to Windows, Animation Editors, and Graph Editor, since this is something about animation that I want to change. Windows, Animation Editors, Graph Editor. With that open, it's a floating window all to itself. I do want to mention that you can task one of your viewports as this if you would like to. So for example, if I was continually, let's say I had my animation camera here, my perspective camera here, my front camera here, I could put my graph editor here. So to do that, it is a panel, and I can go to panels. And you'll notice I closed the graph editor because if I had the graph editor as a floating window, it would actually it would not allow me to task it here because an instance is already open. So if you did want to port it into your 4 viewports, then go ahead and close the floating window and task it here. Oh, there we go. So for a second, it looked like my perspective camera, and that's fine. So your hotkeys will still work here. So in this case, I could look, through here and see it here and hit spacebar and have that fill up my UI, etc. I'm just going to go back to the original 4 viewports, and you can also see here if you prefer to have a 2-up display, you could do the same thing and have one of them be your perspective camera or whatever the case may be. I typically work with a 3+ monitor setup. So I usually have like one full monitor that is dedicated to the graph editor. But I know screen real estate is always something that you're, battling against. So if you want to do it like that, that's absolutely fine. I will use it as a floating window, and I'll keep probably struggling back and forth with this. You'll also see that as I start to hover over areas, it's trying to push that into the UI. So if that happens to you and you end up with something like this and you're like, oh my gosh, no worries, we can just go back up to the workspace and say reset current workspace. And you should get back, you do lose your outliner there, but that's fine. And we'll get back to the normal, hypothetically, there we go, the normal view set. Okay, so let's get into it. So the graph editor here, and it's on my other screen. Everything got reset, and that's good. Okay, and you'll notice that nothing is here, and that's because nothing is selected. So I'm just going to push this over to my third monitor if it wants to go. That would be great. And I'm going to select this cube. In some cases, when you're dealing with characters, you would select the controls, not the geometry. But in this case, the keyframes lie on the geometry of this object. So with that selected, I can see the keyframes, and with that selected, I can also see it within the graph editor here. So right out of the gate, we can see on this left side column, the running list of my selection. So for a character, this would likely be the control, not the geometry, as we mentioned before, and then everything that we have here. So you'll notice a few things. I'm going to jump down to the rotation just to demonstrate this. The rotation, all X, Y, and Z, and keeping in mind that RGB, XYZ, a little moniker that we'll constantly use, red being X, Y being green, blue being Z. So XYZ, RGB, right? So we can see here that they are what's referred to as static channels. So they do not change over time. In some cases that might be helpful, but in this one it's just sort of dead in the water. And then similarly with the scale is not animated as we continue, so it sits right at 1. Rotation sits at 0, and scale sits at 1. So it's still a static channel because there has been no change, but I'm still telling it to sit in that spot, whether it's frame 1 or frame 48. So making this a bit wider on my screen so we can take a look at what's being analyzed here. I'll jump over to Translate X just to show us the values here. And we can see at frame 1, which I can click and drag up here just to get to that position. At frame 1, I have a value for this p-cube1 at -8 in the Translate X. And then that transitions through this type of behavior all the way to 12, where the value is 0, or close thereof. I can also, and I do have my Translate tool active here, but if I had my just regular selection tool active here, I could select this, and I could also see, and I'll make this a little bit larger. Go ahead, there we go. Okay, so with that selected, I said it's almost 0, but not quite. So I can see here the stats of this are going to say the frame number, as well as the value of that specific selection. So in this case, it's not quite 0. It looks like 0, but it's not quite there. And then, if I didn't have that selected, I wouldn't be able to see that, okay? I can also select, the whole curve, and as I move here, it should highlight, but that's fine. So I'll select this one, and you can see that value as well. So this is live. So for example, if I change this to 20 and hit enter, we'll see that immediately change in here, but I'll also see that immediately change. It's way off the grid now. Right here. It's no longer back here, it's all the way up at 20. So whatever you do in the editor, the graph editor immediately has a change for the final. Okay, so let's get that back. My graph editor. Come back. Okay, there it is. So I'll select it here, and I think I had it at 8. So I'll push it back to 8. And then we should be good to go. And I see that I have the cube selected, so I see every little string, at the same time. And I'm just using my regular hotkeys for the camera motion. So Alt and the right mouse button. There is also, I have to watch my hands do it. If you add in the Shift modifier key, so Alt, Shift, and the right click and drag, I really like this because it can help you kind of divvy down the size if you want to. So that's Alt and Shift, and you can do that upwards as well. So value as I'm pushing my mouse up and down, and then to right and left. So that can be really helpful in just filling the space with whatever it is you're analyzing, but the regular Alt and drag will just be kind of like zoom in, zoom out. Okay, so Alt and Shift was the other one. And then similarly, I can hold down Alt and middle mouse click and drag up and down, left and right. I have to again watch my hands do it, there we go. Another way that I typically move around in the graph editor is holding down Alt and Control, and this will also work in your viewport, which I'll show you in just a second. So let me tap A here to frame in all, so that's coming to us from our regular viewport as well. If I have anything selected, I can tap F to focus in on them, but I can also force that framing by holding down Alt and Control, and then clicking and dragging a bounding box over what I would like to focus on. So you can see here, as I hold down Alt and Control with my left hand and my right-handed mouse-ness or whatever, I can click and drag and zoom in on that and try to force the framing. So sometimes, when you tap F, it's not quite what you want because you still see other junk. So in some cases you can use that zoom to get a little bit closer, and then tapping A to jump back out. So very similarly, just to exemplify the point here, we can use those same hotkeys inside of the viewport. So with it selected here, I could tap F, I could tap A, which there's nothing else in this scene, so it's not going to focus on anything else. But I could also hold down Alt and Control and zoom in like that, and then it's just going to continually take me into that bounding box that I create. Okay, so let me tap F, which is A, basically the same thing, and bring back my graph editor. Okay, so wonderful. So there we go. So now we can start to see how we can move around. A few things inside of here that we could do. Let's say that I didn't want this to start right at 1. I wanted it to start at 10, right? And just push. I like what everything's doing. I just want to shift everything over. So we can do this en masse, and this can be very helpful if your client's like, I wanted to start a second or two later, and you're like, oh my gosh, it's already all fully animated and you have all of these crazy strings. So to do this, I'm just going to zoom out, like all the way out, so I can be sure that I'm grabbing everything. Click and drag to make a mass rubber band selection over everything. And just as a reminder, I do have the selection tool active, although if you're in the move tool or anything else, that should work too as far as the selection, but that's what I have currently active. Q is my hotkey there. And again, I can hover over that, and if you looked down here, you'll see the select tool there. Okay. So as I have everything selected, I want to move it. So that is a function of the translate tool, which I'll tap W on my keyboard or just click it right here. W is faster. And as I start to middle mouse button click in and drag, you can see that I can move this wherever I want in time, but also in value. So this is like free range, which makes me super nervous all the time. So I'm going to tap Z to undo that. But we can change that and really lock in the value or in either direction. So you're locking in time or you're locking in value. So that's this one here. So right now I have unconstrained drag, right, which sounds really fun. And then as I hover over that, what is it? Constrained x-axis. And if I do it one more time, we'll get the arrows pointing up and down, and that's my constrained y-axis. So I'm going to choose the constrained x-axis. I want the values to remain the same for this, but I just want to shift it to start at 10. And I can move my playhead to 10 if that helps me. So now that I have that active, I'm going to click and drag over everything, W to activate move, because I want to move it. And then middle mouse button, click in, and it doesn't matter if I go up and down with my mouse. It's just going to worry about the X. So that can be super helpful. I don't know when it was that I learned that, but it's like when I did, I was like, you've got to be kidding me. I've been doing this the hard way the whole time. So those are some tips and tricks. And then just to flip it over to the next one, right? So same thing, selecting everything, tapping W on my keyboard. And as I try to move it from side to side, it's not going to happen. It's only going to adjust the value up and down. That one I would say I use less often because it's, maybe for translate, but for something like rotate, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I'll tap Z on my keyboard to undo that and then bring us back to that full, unrestricted view. Sometimes I leave this camped out in the X and Y view. So if you feel like you have like way too much control and way too much leniency, go ahead and just flick your eyes up here to make sure that you are in the right setting. Okay. We sort of grazed over some of these right here, which are very important aspects that we'll definitely get to as we continue. But just to work a little bit more thoughtfully with these, we can see here that these are all of the tangents that I can use. Okay, so currently, as I select them all, they should be in auto tangent. Yep, I don't know why it's not showing that. Let me make sure. Okay, there's no visual change. I believe they're all defaulted to that. The possible exception to that would be, let me jump into the Y, for example. Yeah, they're all auto tangents. Okay, which is this first one. So it's going to do the best that it can, and it does an okay job, but it's not great because it's not paying attention to what you actually need. It's just saying, like, I don't know, just go for it, auto. So it's trying to look at what's around it and make its best judgment. And we can see that we have the spline tangents, the clamped tangents, the linear tangents, the flat tangents, step tangents, and then our final one being the plateau tangents. So we'll primarily actually do it ourselves, but we'll stick with mostly auto tangents. If we need the linear tangents, we'll do that, and if we need to flatten any tangents, we'll do that. So those are probably the three that we'll stick with. Sometimes it might be helpful to see stepped tangents, so I will talk about that very briefly. So let me do that here. So I'll select all three of these so I can see all of them. Rubber band, select them. The Z doesn't really matter. I'm just using X and Y here, and use that step tangent. So what you should be able to see here, and let's just take a look at the Y, for example. Now it's not making any sort of transition. So what we can expect to see as we look over here is that it's going to hang out in that position. And then it's going to stay, and then it pops to the next one. And we see that being represented in the graph editor very easily, right? So here is the Y value. It's going to stay at 0. And then without any transition, it's just going to like teleport to the next value, which is 6. So we get that pop into existence. This can be helpful for switches. So IK-FK switches, you might not want to ease that transition. You might want to just turn it on and off without any type of transition in between. So that flat tangent, or step tangent, sorry, sometimes if you're coming to me from After Effects, you might be familiar with the hold tangent. So it's the same thing, step tangent, hold tangent. And it's just basically holding that position until you tell me something else, and I will jump to that spot with no transition at all. Other practical applications of this might be, a light. So your character goes to turn on a light and the light pops on. So you want it to stay at 0 until it's supposed to pop on. And then when the light flicks off, there's no dimmer switch there. So it just pops off. So those would be practical examples there. So let me get back to it here. So that's our step tangent, but again, for this, we're not going to be using that. I'll switch it back to auto tangent here, and then start to analyze, in particular, the X. Okay, so we can see here if you do have experience in the pen tool coming from Illustrator, this might already feel a little bit more comfortable to you. And we can see that some of these values right here are really unnecessary for me to get this type of curve, right? And really what we're thinking about here is the points being the keyframes, and then the tangents, right, these little hooks coming out of it. How can I manipulate those so that I can get a smooth transition, or whatever type of transition I want to go between them, right? So at frame 1, it starts at -8. There's a little bit of a ease out of this. We can see it kind of hovering closer to that -8, and then it climbs, right? It starts to climb. It hits this one, and then it starts to kind of ease and settle into this top one. So as we start to see that, it's just basically values, and how do we get from one value to the other. So hypothetically, and if we are trying to make this, 2 points, and how do we get to 2 points? The linear interpolation here, so if I just grab these and tap on the linear, is going to be a straight shot, right? We didn't see that with the auto tangents. The auto tangents are trying to give us a little bit of ease in, ease out, but not so much. So this is going to feel very mechanical, and typically is not what we want, which is why the auto tangents are actually preferable to the linear tangents, and that's why they're default. Okay, we can also, so in this sort of situation, I could delete this keyframe, and it does make a little bit of a change. Okay, but it arguably could be smoother, and I don't want to make these adjustments without taking a look at my animation. But we can see how that might feel a little bit, cleaner. And I'm gonna do my 2-up display because let's keep that as our front, and we'll do the panels here with the, oh, I have it open, let me close it. Panel and graph. And I'll close my channel box. Okay, so we can see that a little bit easier. Okay, so in this way, you can start to understand where maybe we would do something like that, right? And have that just kind of work through itself. And additionally here, if I wanted this to loop forever and ever, what I'm looking at is that the end position is going to loop back around and feed into this position. So I actually don't want it to ease out of this, right? I want it to just act like this tangent and just shoot straight towards the next keyframe. Right, so here we're having it kind of slow into that last pose, and we can see that for these two, right? We have it kind of slow into that pose. So I can definitely change this. So with the keyframe selected, let me move that up so we can focus on it here. So I'll click and drag over that keyframe, tap W to activate my move tool, click and drag over the tangent handle, and then middle mouse button, click in and drag to inform how we get out of that tangent. So in this scenario, since I want it to loop, I might do something that looks like this, so that when it hits here, right, it just comes right back through, and we have a nice, and then same thing on this side. So I would grab these, W, right, and then select the handle, W, and then push that down, and we'll have this nice transition continually. The other ones doesn't matter. And we should be able to see here now if I play this, it does kind of stick there. And the reason for that is that we're repeating that same keyframe. So the last thing I would want to do here, right, because this one is at 48, but it's also at 1. So it's actually spending 2 frames on that single value. So I could do a couple things here. If I wanted it to be that full 48 frames, no problem. I would select that, right? Let me do it holistically. And then making sure that I'm just moving over, I'll tap W and just move that over 1 frame. So now it should be at 49. So as we approach 48, right, it is going to be basically the keyframe prior to this, and then it will hit that same keyframe coming back as it transitions back to 1 and loops through. So now we shouldn't have as much of a stick. It is kind of popping on that though. And that's because of the X, it looks like. And that's okay. Okay, so we could, we could mix with any one of these. Maybe I'll try, let's do the, should be this one. Let's do these tangents and see how that works for us. I think it's also the value. And another good way, if you are, and this is for very specific for looping animations, but if you are looking to, and it should be under view, if you are looking to try to visualize that a little bit more cleanly, we can go up to view and choose to view infinity, right? And what this will show us is like what's happening after that keyframe. And I can also choose to view it should be after post infinity. I guess they changed it. That's okay. It should be called view post infinity or infinity. Huh. I know they made some changes to the graph editor, but I thought this still stayed in it. Here it is. So if we do something like this and we say cycle, right, and then we say post infinity cycle, we can see how this is hitting that and then coming back. So in this case, maybe we would grab these and flatten those out. Okay, and then same thing for the green. I would grab the green and say pre-infinity cycle, post-infinity cycle, and we can rather plainly see how this is going to cycle and kind of continuously go through that. So that pop that we were having was on the red axis, which is it should be cleaner now. There it goes. Sort of speeds up there, and that's probably because of the timing. But in this way, you can start to see how, using the graph editor in conjunction with your viewport can be very, very effective. So hopefully you can follow along with this type of example and get something that's, making sense as you look at the translate, rotate, and scale. Okay. And thinking about, how does that apply for what I'm trying to do. And in the next video, we'll talk more about a bipedal character and using a lot of these little strings and how to make more sense of them.